Hi, good evening or good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome from Jerusalem. My name is Karen Sethill from the National Library of Israel, and I'm very pleased to be opening this evening's event on the British Jewry Book of Honour. When we first heard about this possible event, we were thinking of including it in our series marking the Platinum Jubilee year of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, celebrating the rich history of Anglo Jewry. We chose to hold it in November as the month of remembrance, when in the UK and elsewhere, we remember the fallen from both world wars. How could we have known then that by the time of this event, we would be just 10 weeks since Her Majesty's passing? So perhaps it's appropriate that this Anglo Jewry event is about a book that honors those that served their country. I have very great pleasure in introducing our speakers for this evening. Ronnie and Lola Fraser are researchers for the history website British Jews in the First World War, which commemorates the efforts of the Jewish community in the First World War. Ronnie is a retired college lecturer and is the author of British Trade Unions, the Labour Party in Israel's Histadrut, which was published in February this year. Lola is a retired teacher with a degree in history and sociology. Since 2016, they've given many talks on different aspects of Jewish involvement in World War I. Ronnie and Lola will be very happy to answer your questions after their talk. And as Tadeo said, please put these in the chat. But before we hear from Ronnie and Lola, we've asked our colleague, reference librarian Daniel Lipson, to join us and present some of the National Library of Israel's items relating to World War I. So Daniel, over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Just going to share the screen. And let me know if we're on full screen.
No, not at the moment.
Okay, so we'll do it this differently.
Oh, now it's fine, yeah.
Okay, so good evening, everybody. And I want to this evening show you some items from the National Library's collections related to Jewish soldiers and their families and their communities during the Great War, during World War I. So about a million and a half Jews served in the various armies during World War I, both with the Allied forces and the Central Powers. At times they found themselves fighting each other, and there are many stories, some legends, and even halachic questions that deal with this. And we find them all over the globe, even here in Israel, in Jerusalem. We can see on the top soldiers, Jewish soldiers in the Austro-Hungarian army praying at the Kotel at the Western Wall. And then a few years later, their so-called enemies, the Jewish soldiers in the British army, exactly the same place by the Kotel. They may be wearing different uniforms and speaking different languages, but they all pray the same prayers. And here are a few examples of the prayer books, the Sidurim and other books that they used during the war. So we have in our collections many pictures of Jewish soldiers in various places in Europe during prayers on festivals and on weekdays. Here, for example, is the prayer book for Jewish soldiers and sailors and soldiers, which came out in about 101,000 copies for the Jewish servicemen in the First World War. They gave about 11,000 of these to their American comrades when they joined the war in 1917. And later on, the Americans printed their own prayer book, which also includes songs and anthems, national songs, and at the back of the Siddur itself. About 200,000, more than 200,000 of these books were printed and given to Jewish soldiers serving in the American army in France. Here is another one. This one was printed in Vienna for soldiers in the Austrian army and Austro-Hungarian army in 1914 at the beginning of the war. This particular copy survived the war, but 25 years later was looted by the Nazis. And then it made its way to the National Library of Israel, but that, of course, is a different story. We have other prayer books in German for German soldiers during the war. This one is for the French soldier It's more of a Sephardic tradition, since many of the soldiers in the French army came from North Africa and other places. Here is a tiny one from Austro-Hungary. It's printed. It's translated both to German and to Hungarian. It's very short. All of these prayer books are very short and only include part of the prayers that we know today, a few from weekdays, some from Shabbat and from other festivals, but all of them are very, very short. The idea was that these Sidurim probably weren't used by the religious soldier, who probably brought his own with him, but rather for soldiers who found the need in time of battle to turn to God and recite some prayers. And these were published, these were printed for them. Not only Sidurim, not only prayer books, other were books of study and learning and religious sources, like the ones we can see here. They're printed in England, printed in America. Most famous one was printed by Chief Rabbi Yosef Hertz. His famous Jewish book of Jewish thoughts, which was actually the idea of his wife, who was looking for a book to study, and in the end he decided to write it himself. The book includes stories of Jewish history and songs, different paragraphs about faith and sacrifice during the war. And the book became very, very popular. Came out in many editions, some 35 editions, and was translated in many languages. In 1924, just a few years after the war, it was translated into German, the language of the enemy, and then later on into Hebrew and even into Arabic. Here we have another book. This was printed in Egypt for the Jewish soldiers serving in Egypt before they disembarked to Gallipoli and to other places. They were addressed by the chief rabbi of Egypt, Rabbi Raphael de Fergola, and he spoke to them, and his speech was printed in this book. And he mentions that you are now leaving Egypt after your period of training. You had a very difficult time, just as your forefathers before you in Egypt, but they left and continued on to the Holy Land, and you are also ready to embark on your mission to Europe. This very small, pocket-sized book of prayers and other things as well was used by British soldiers, and you can just imagine them reciting a prayer from this book and then pocketing it at the sound of the whistle being blown, and then charging into no man's land with this in their pocket. Here's a prayer, a single page in Italian. And here we can see at the top of the page that the soldier says that I'm joining the army, I'm participating in this war, not because of hate or evil, but for the holy obligation to my country. And he asks for forgiveness if he has to raise his hand against God's creations. Here is another one in Italian for Jewish soldiers in the Italian army. At the bottom of the page, we can see short prayer to save and help our King Vittorio Emanuele III. You can see here in the picture. This prayer was said for Franz Joseph, the Emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And here we have one for Kaiser William II and his wife Augusta Victoria. Also for Kaiser William, we find this short booklet, which was printed specially for his birthday, celebrated by Jewish soldiers serving in Vilna at the time. So this is a festive divine service for Jewish military members of the 10th Army on occasion of His Majesty's birthday. This is in 1917. And one more for the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed Rashid V, which is also just a lone page from the library's collections. At the beginning of the war, President Woodrow Wilson claimed that let there be peace, and all congregations around America, Jewish and Christian and everyone else, should pray because of a difficult situation in Europe. This book was prepared by the community in Chicago, It contains prayer for peace in the world, and the rabbi addresses the congregation, and among other things says that some believe that we should celebrate this day more this time than any other, because while all other nations of the world are at each other's throats, we in America are at peace. Little did you know that 2.5 years later or so, America would join the war as well. We have prayers here printed in the UK, which were recited after every Sabbath after the prayer for the king and the royal family. And at the end of the war, it was changed to this short prayer book, which we have here. The final prayer is this one in Dutch. This wasn't printed for soldiers, of course. The Netherlands were neutral during the war, and here they pray that keep us out of the war and save our country, and that's exactly what's happened. And apart from prayer books, and other books which were printed for the soldiers, after the war, the communities printed many books with the names of these soldiers, those who fought, those who fell during the war. There was a lot of anti-Semitism during the war and after the war, especially in Germany, but all over the world. And the Jewish communities wanted to show that they did their part in this war as well. So this is one of the famous books printed in Germany. There were about 100,000 Jewish soldiers in the German army. About 12,000 of them were killed during the war, and this book includes the names. But some communities in Germany printed their own books with names and stories of soldiers from their communities, like this one from Munich. This one from Württemberg includes, you can see the columns. Apart from the name, you have the unity served in and the rank and what happened, if they were killed or injured. Here are some more from Germany. This one is from France, where many soldiers served, and about 8,000 of them were killed as well. Another book from France includes names of soldiers serving in the French army, but from foreign countries like Belgium and Switzerland and Italy and other places, who actually joined the French army. Maybe they were in France at the time, and this book includes some of their names. There's another one from Romania and from Italy, and a large one from Hungary, which includes names of soldiers who fell, who fought, who received medals. This one is from Serbia. The war started because when Austro-Hungary declared war against Serbia, and here this book also includes some pictures of some of the soldiers serving in that army. We don't have a list of a book with lists of names of American soldiers. In this report, we can see on the right-hand page, it says that there were 65,000 records of Jews. That was corrected to 100,000. And in other reports, there are numbers like 200 and 225,000 American Jews serving during the First World War. This is a book of Australian Jewry, which with pictures and names of Jews serving in the Australian Army. And finally, the topic of our lecture this evening, the British Jewry Book of Honor, which includes the names of 50,000 Jews serving in the British Army. And I'm very pleased, Lola and Ronnie, to pass it on to you. I'll just stop sharing the screen.
Can anybody hear me? Can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Yes,
you,
we can.
Martin.
The sound.
Excuse me, Martin, this is not the right time for any comments. Please wait until the end of the event. Ronnie and Lola, please start.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The British Jewry Book of Honour, a very special memorial to those Jews who served the British Empire during the First World War. Why was it published? Initially, we thought it formed part of the general outpouring of grief over the loss of so many young men. After the end of the war, memorials were placed in every town and village which had lost boys, and there are only 56 places in England without such a memorial. These are known as thankful villages. Churches and synagogues erected memorial plaques. The Association of Ex-Jewish Servicemen, AJEX, was formed later to keep the camaraderie which bonded the men alive. There were memorials which happened. These were memorials which happened after the end of the war, but the idea of a Jewish Book of Honor was already in place at the beginning of the war. How did they know such a book should be compiled? Why can't it
I
go?
don't know. Just one second, we got a slight technical problem.
Yeah.
It was clear that the idea of the book had come from the Jewish Chronicle. Research eventually gave us the answer. On looking in old Jewish yearbooks, we found that a list of over 600 names of soldiers who had fought in the Boer War had been published in the 1900 edition, and the names had come from lists put together by the Jewish Chronicle. Thus, it was not a new idea, but a continuation of what had gone before, so that on the 4th of September 1914, 6 weeks after the start of World War I, a notice appeared in the Jewish Chronicle stating that they would publish a record of names and addresses week by week of those Jews serving, so that by the end of the war, a book would be published and submitted to the king for his gracious acceptance. When the book was completed, it consisted of over 1,000 pages, and a limited edition of 3,000 copies was produced. Each week, the Jewish Chronicle published a list of those who enlisted, together with lists of promotions, wounded, missing, and of course, the fallen.
When times were quiet, like the edition of the 7th of January 1916, it only published the names of 4 killed in action and 2 wounded, or March the 17th, 1916, where there is only the name of 1 fatality and 3 wounded mentioned. But when the action was at its height, huge numbers were included, so that although after the first day of the Battle of the Somme, which saw the largest loss of life in a single day ever for the British Army, in the July the 7th, 1916 edition, there were only 3 killed in action, 1 died of wounds and 3 wounded, 1 of whom was a sailor. We have to remember that communication was very different at the beginning of the 20th century to now. And by the 14th of July 1916, 2 weeks after the battle, the paper recorded 16 deaths, 52 wounded, and 2 missing soldiers. The book eventually listed 36 who were killed that day. As well as the lists of dead and wounded, the 7th of July edition of the Jewish Chronicle noted that Sergeant Joseph Kemper, who was the first Jew to serve in the Royal Flying Corps, had been awarded the Medal Militaire by the President of the French Republic in recognition of his distinguished service during the campaign, which is the 3rd highest award of the French Republic. Nobody knows why he received this medal, because Joseph was not an NCO, a non-commissioned officer, and because he was a chief mechanic and not a pilot. Kemper was commissioned as an officer in 1916, and by the end of the war, he had been promoted to Major Joseph Kemper, MBE, and went on to serve in Iraq and Egypt during the 1920s. He retired from the RAF in 1931. Joseph was a Zionist, and in 1935 went to Palestine as chief engineer for the Carmel Automobile Company, which had just opened a factory in Haifa to assemble standard motor cars. Production was halted the following year after only 20 cars had been assembled because of the Arab uprising against British rule in Palestine. In 2014, the Israeli Post Office issued this stamp on your screen to commemorate the building of the first cars in Palestine. Kemper also worked for the Haganah, training pilots. His cover story was that as Major Kemper, he was in charge of the RAF base at Ramla Airfield, which of course was not true. Every 2 weeks, he traveled from Haifa to Kibbutz Dagania to teach a group of Jews the principles of flight in the roof space of a cowshed. As Kemper was very well connected with the leaders of the Jewish community in Palestine, and because of his cover story, no one questioned him flying one of the few privately owned planes in Palestine. One day on a flight from Haifa to Atlit with one of his pupils, they had engine trouble and the plane got caught in the telephone wires near the Carmel station and crashed. The two men escaped injury and Kemper immediately disappeared, leaving his pupil behind. Within minutes, Navy, Air Force and Red Cross vehicles appeared on the scene. Then a big black car appeared, and in the car was Joseph and David HaKohen, a leading member of the Jewish community in Palestine. David HaKohen used his influence with the British. Some whiskey and cigarettes and a few pounds changed hands, and nothing further was said about the crash. Although Joseph had returned to Britain in 1938 to rejoin the RAF, his lectures to the Haifa Aero and Gliding Club were noted in an article in the Palestine Post of January 1939. Joseph Kemper was one of a number of Jews who served in both World War I and World War II. As I said, he rejoined the RAF in 1938 and served throughout the war at the RAF flying boat base at Greenock on the Clyde.
It might be a good idea at this point to explain a little about Anglo-Jewry's idiosyncrasies at this time, as all Jewish ministers of religion except the chief rabbi were called reverends. The story goes that Nathan Marcus Adler, chief rabbi from 1845 until his death in 1890, had decreed that only the chief rabbi was learned enough to hold the title rabbi. This was because he felt that the level of Jewish education for ministers was not high enough in England to warrant them being given the title of rabbi, and that all other Jewish ministers were to be known as reverend. It was said that Adler thus became a general with no soldiers. Reverend Michael Adler, the minister of the Central Synagogue in London, is usually credited with being the driving force in producing the book. One of 8 children of Joseph and Betsy Adler, born in 1868 in the East End of London and educated initially at the Jews Free School, what we know today as JFS. He then studied at Jewish College, and by the age of 22 in 1890, he was minister of Hammersmith Synagogue and was already publishing books on Hebrew grammar. In 1903, he left Hammersmith to take up the position of minister at the Central Synagogue, from where in 1906, he succeeded Reverend Francis Cohen as senior chaplain to the armed forces and the Jewish Lads Brigade, whose camp he was attending in July 1914 when war broke out. The camp had to be closed down early, as JLB were advised that there would be difficulties for the boys getting home, as the trains had been commandeered by the War Office for the movement of troops going to France. After the war, Adler returned to the Central Synagogue and was very involved with the Jewish Historical Society of England, serving as editor and president between 1934 and 1936. In March 1914, the War Office decided that there were sufficient numbers of Jews in the forces for them to pass on those names and other relevant information to Reverend Adler. This then, along with the information sent to the Jewish Chronicle by individual families, became the basis of the British Jewry Book of Honour. From the beginning of the war, Reverend Adler was saying that the number of Jews known to be serving was a huge underestimate. He said that according to the official return dated October 1913, the number was put at 236. This figure, he said, should be multiplied by 3 at least to arrive at the true total. People, particularly new immigrants, having just fled pogroms in Russia and Poland, were reluctant to state their religion, and therefore it was difficult for the War Office to know they were Jewish. One prominent soldier who was Jewish but spent his life hiding his Jewish identity was Leopold Amory, the son of Charles Amory and Elizabeth Leitner Safir, a Hungarian Jewess. He was a British MP from 1911 until 1945. Who was strongly in favour of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Amory saw active service in Flanders and the Near East between 1914 and 1916. He was on the staff of the War Council for the negotiations at Versailles and served on the personal staff of Lord Milner, the Secretary of State for War from 1917 to 1918 as Assistant Secretary to the War Cabinet. Not only did Amory facilitate Zev Jabotinsky, the Zionist leader, in gaining official British approval for the formation of the Jewish Legion in 1917, but he also wrote one of the drafts which ultimately became the Balfour Declaration. Just before the War Cabinet met on October the 4th, 1917, as Amory recalled in his diary, Lord Alfred Milner asked him to draft something which would go a reasonable distance to meet the objections of both the Jewish and pro-Arab groups. The result was the Milner-Amory draft, written under extreme time pressures, contained the essential points of the final draft, though it referred to the Jewish race instead of people.
In January 1915, Reverend Adler became the first Jewish chaplain to be sent abroad with the troops, and Reverend Lipson took over as chaplain to the troops in the United Kingdom. Adler was known as the Wandering Jew because of the great distances he covered in his car carrying out his duties as chaplain to the forces. By the end of the war, there were over 30 Jewish chaplains and officiating clergymen working in all areas of combat. Whilst the salaries of these ministers were paid by the Ministry of War, they were not exactly overpaying them, refusing to increase the payments during the war. The synagogues these ministers were attached to had to employ a replacement minister, and when the original minister returned, then the replacement had to be let go. It was a tough world 100 years ago. The Jewish Chronicle kept notes of the awards listed in the London Gazette, and each week would publish all the names in the paper, keeping these lists to publish in the promised book at the end of the war. The book tells us that there were 2,425 Jewish officers and men who fell in action or died on active service, and 6,500 were wounded. Died on active service means not just those who died of their wounds, but also those who died of flu. Remember, this was the time of the Spanish flu epidemic, and also in the case of the Judeans, malaria. Like Lance Corporal Melndil Isidore Trachtenberg of the 39th Battalion, who died of malaria in October 1918, which he caught while on active service in the Jordan Valley. A graduate of Latimer Upper School in London and St John's College, Cambridge, he left not only grieving parents, but also a grieving widow, and is buried in Jerusalem's war cemetery. When the Jewish War Services Committee was formed in May 1916, it was run through the offices of Rothschild's Bank in St Swithin's Lane. It then became the official link between the Jewish community and the War Office, taking over responsibility for chaplaincy from the Visitation Committee of the United Synagogue. And at that point, all the information regarding promotions, wounded and killed service personnel came through them and was passed on to the Jewish Chronicle. The Jewish Chronicle stated that war pictures were being published in the Jewish world, and these pictures became the basis for the photographs at the back of the Book of Honor, along with photographs of war memorials, groups of soldiers, and other photographs. The true number of Jews who served is unclear. We usually take the figure to be 50,000, as mentioned on page 1 of the book, although Winston Churchill, in his comments, also in the book, estimates the figure to be 60,000.
At the end of the war, Reverend Michael Adler was appointed the editor of the book, although Max R.G. Freeman of Manchester was appointed the producer and organizer, following his work producing similar publications for Birmingham and Manchester and Salford. The book goes on to talk about the 5 VCs, Victoria Cross winners: Lieutenant Frank de Pass, Sergeant Izzy Smith, Captain Robert G. MC, Lieutenant Leonard Kaiser and Private Jack White, or Weiss, also have their own picture page. Of these 5, only Frank Alexander de Pass was killed before he received this award, the highest award for gallantry in the British Army. He was a career soldier. Having signed up in 1906, he was the first Jewish soldier to receive the VC, gaining it in November 1914. Sergeant Izzy Smith, originally called Yishrolach Shmilevitz, born in Alexandria, he stowed away on a ship to London. Leaving school aged 14, he enlisted in the British Army aged 16 by lying about his age. It was then that he changed his name to the anglicised Izzy Smith. Izzy served with the 3rd Battalion Manchester Regiment for 8 years before the outbreak of World War I. He was the first surviving Jew in the First World War to receive the VC. The other 3 VCs also survived the war. Captain Robert G., a boy from a poor background, he became an MP after the war, but became disillusioned with parliamentary life and emigrated to Western Australia with his family, finding peace as a farmer. Leonard Kaiser, although born in London, he had emigrated to Australia before the First World War and served in the 1st Australian Imperial Force. After being wounded and receiving his VC at the end of the war, he returned to Australia, but eventually returned to England. Jack Weiss, or White, a founder member of AJAX, the Association of Jewish Ex-Servicemen and Women, was born in Leeds. After the war, he returned to the family rainwear business, which is still in the family's hands today. The book is not just a list of names, but it also consists of words of support from distinguished men, including Winston Churchill MP, at that time the Secretary of State for War, Lord Northcliffe, the Earl of Reading, and of course the Chief Rabbi, Rabbi Hertz, who listed the names of the patrons, who include all the wealthy and the good, including Lord Rothschild, Sir Robert Whaley-Cohen, and as well as a number of lesser well-known names.
There are words of support from many of the donors, as well as other luminaries, such as Field Marshal Earl Haig and Sir John Monash, the Lieutenant General of the Australian Forces. He was the most senior-ranking Jewish soldier, born in Melbourne, Australia in 1865. In 1884, John Monash joined the University Company 4th Battalion Victorian Rifles. In 1915, he came under fire at Gallipoli and was the only Australian brigade commander among the original troops not killed or evacuated or as wounded. Monash was transferred to the Western Front in June 1916, where he so impressed British High Command that Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig wanted him as commander of the Australian Corps. On the 1st of June 1918, Monash was appointed Lieutenant General and Commander of the Australian Corps. This promotion was not without its critics, not least because some people had reservations about his ideals. These were based on his Prussian German background. For that, read Jewishness. By the end of the war, he had led his men to victories in several battles, including Mont Saint-Quentin, Péronne, Harcourt, and he planned the attack on the Hindenburg Line in September-October 1918. He was knighted as Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath by King George V. Although the majority of Jews who served came from Britain, a large number came from the 150,000 Jews who lived in the Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the West Indies, and other colonies. The proportion of Jews who enlisted was very high. In Australia, for example, out of a total Jewish population of 19,000, 1,800 men enlisted, of which 250 died on active service. Not all the letters from distinguished men were as positive as others. Lord Northcliffe, the owner of the Daily Mail, makes the following interesting comment. Nearly 9,000 Jews in the British Army alone fell in action or were wounded and missing. And missing, of course, means dead. The Jews are a very cautious people and not anxious to make war, but in this great conflict, they waged it just as vigorously as they did in the wars of the Bible. This was the belief many people had that Jews were shirkers and had not served, an accusation which led to the Jewish riots, the Leeds riots of 1917 and the attacks on Jews in the East End of London. This accusation is what we now consider to be a racist slur, but at that time considered acceptable. It was, of course, untrue, since more Jews served, 13% of the Jewish population, than the rest of the population, 12%.
Women are hugely underrepresented. Out of the 50,000, there are only 66 women listed in the book as having received honours of mentions. Of those, 8 are listed twice. Right at the end of the written lists is one tucked away on page 596, entitled Various Units. And within that, there are just over 100 names of women who served mainly as voluntary aid detachment nurses, VADs, but it all includes a few Red Cross and Queen Alexandra Imperial Nursing Service nurses, Quints. There are just 2 nurses, Emily Hartman and Edith Munro, mentioned in the list of the fallen. Emily Hartman's picture appears on page 52 of the photographs, but she is not mentioned in the index of illustrations. Women originally did not get Commonwealth war graves, but thanks to the tireless efforts of Martin Sugarman of Ajax, Edith is one who has now received this recognition. Out of over 300 pages of photographs, there are just 2 pages of photographs of women and 4 or 5 pages of photographs taken at hospitals where women appear. During this time, at the beginning of the 20th century, women were not allowed to be part of the military, and so they tried to serve in other ways, many of them taking up nursing roles in order to do their bit. Miss Janie Joseph is one of those who has 2 mentions, an OBE for her work at Tudor House in Hampstead, Tudor House, which was a hospital, listed as the commandant at Tudor House Military Hospital, and another mention as a VAD, commended for home war service. She also has her photograph in the book, along with a couple of her with other nurses. Other women who put in hundreds or even thousands of hours of unpaid work are not mentioned. Therefore, people like Dora Bunny Bernstein, who came from South Africa to serve as a nurse and then died, are not mentioned. In the main, though, it records those who fought. Some perished like Barnet Grew, an ordinary soldier, rifleman with the London Regiment, a talented artist and still remembered by his great-nephew, or Jack David, who was never found, and his only gravestone is the Teepval Memorial. They, like so many others, died on the 1st of July 1916, the first day of the Somme.
Some servicemen mentioned in the Book of Honour served in more than one conflict. One such man was Lionel Cohen, who was born in Newcastle and served as a trooper in the South African Matabele War of 1893, in the Boer War of 1899, where he operated behind enemy lines in Portuguese East Africa, and in the First World War as a second lieutenant in the East African campaign against the German forces based there. He was seconded to the Royal Naval Air Service and served as an observer with No. 7 Squadron on many reconnaissance missions, for which he was awarded the Military Cross in 1917 and the Distinguished Service Order a year later. At the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, Lionel, then aged 64, rejoined the RAF and served as a Coastal Command liaison officer with the Admiralty. He took part in 70 operational flights as observer and gunner. In 1944, as Wing Commander Lionel Cohen, who was at the time the oldest frontline airman in the RAF, was awarded the DFC by George VI. Lionel Cohen, who has the unique record of serving in all 3 armed services and 4 wars, died in August 1960, aged 85.
The book, of course, contains lists. The first list is of the fallen, men who died during the war. Then, of course, there are hundreds of pages listing the servicemen in their regiments. The book lists them in each regiment with the officers first and then the NCOs and men. Those given an asterisk are the fallen, so basically they're in the book twice. The work was complicated. Men, not officers, were assigned a number. If they were sent to a different regiment, they were reassigned a new number and the old number could be given to someone else. It was not until after the First World War that a soldier kept his number throughout. The reassigning of men meant that some people are in the book twice or three times or more, sometimes with different numbers. A certain, he is listed as David Benjamin Gurion, illustrates just this. His number was 5770 and had been previously belonged to a Private George Green of the Royal Defence Corps. Green's record shows that he was discharged on the 2nd of June 1916. Ben Gurion swore his oath of allegiance in the offices of the British Consul in New York on the 28th of May 1918, then set out to do training in Windsor, Canada with the 39th Battalion Royal Fusiliers. It was there that he met up with Yitzhak Ben Zvi. Against his better judgment, Ben Gurion was promoted to corporal and arrived in Port Said, Egypt in August 1918. He traveled to Cairo where the Palestinian battalion was encamped when he fell ill with dysentery. He was hospitalized for several weeks. He rejoined his battalion, which was then posted to Palestine. A day after arriving, he left camp without a pass and made his way round Jaffa, seeking converts to the Zionist cause. On his return to camp after a 4-day absence, he was caught, tried, and sentenced to be demoted to the rank of private, fined for 3 days' pay and transferred to another company, the 40th Battalion Royal Fusiliers. A few days later, he received a month's leave and returned to his political activities. Then there was the problem of spelling. Unlike the 21st century, in the early days of the 20th century, people were not so particular with how they spelt their names. Thus, Friedman could be spelt with the D or without. Alternatively, it might be spelt Friedman. Many of these Jewish men changed their names to sound more English. Thus, Rosenbaum became Rosen, Russell, Ross, or Rosen. Ettinger became Edgar, and Myers became Smith, to name but a few.
Majority of the pages contain 12 photos of different people. Some are headed in memoriam. There are pictures of some memorial boards, not just British synagogue memorials, but also from Cape Town and Sydney. There are photos of a few graves with the original simple Magen David, which were subsequently taken down when it was agreed to give every soldier a uniform gravestone. There are group photos, some of the Jewish lads who were staying at the Deal camp when war broke out, others of the Judeans, the 38th to 42nd Royal Fusiliers, and the Zion Mule Corps. There are group photos. One double page spread here is of the 40th Fusiliers, the Palestinians, both at recruitment and then 2 weeks later. There is even one, the bottom right of your screen, of a group of Jewish soldiers on Rosh Hashanah 1918 in Calcutta. The book is only as good as the information Reverend Adler and Max Freeman received. It does contain mistakes and omissions. Our research has revealed that, for example, 4 soldiers of the Judeans mentioned in the Chicago Tribune on April the 8th, 1919, under the headline, Mauritania brings men of British and US armies home, only Samuel Miskin is listed in the book. There are also at least 2 high-profile entries in the book who are not Jewish. Both Captain Roy Manza and Captain Karl Falkenberg, who were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, were Christians. Manza was a Canadian World War I flying ace credited with 12 aerial victories, and Falkenberg, who was awarded a bar to his DFC, was the grandson of a Swedish nobleman from Newfoundland. We have been unable to discover why the editors included them. Our best guess is that they had Jewish-sounding names. At the beginning of the 20th century, Jews were thought of as being unwilling to fight, and anti-Semitism was rife in many countries. It was, after all, only 12 years since the end of the Dreyfus affair in France, and 30 to 40 years since the pogroms of the Pale of Settlement in Russia. Ultimately, the book was produced in order to show the loyalty of British and colonial Jews to the British Crown. As the book states on page 1, British Jews had only enjoyed emancipation since 1854, and this was, to quote the book, the opportunity to justify that emancipation, albeit 60 years later.
The book also has many pages relating to the Tsar Mule Corps and the Judeans, the 38th to 40th Royal Fusiliers, of which there are over 6,000 names from what is now called Israel, perhaps, but what was then called Palestine. These Jews served valiantly at Gallipoli in 1915 as the Tsar Mule Corps, after which they were stood down in May 1916. Excuse me. Thanks to the efforts of Zeb Jabotinsky and Joseph Trumpeldor, these men formed the basis of the Judeans, who went on to serve, excuse me, with distinction in Palestine. The 38th to 40th battalions, known as the Judeans, were made up as follows. The 38th were primarily English Jews, as well as those of the Tsar Mule Corps. The 39th battalion were made up mainly of American, Canadian, and Argentinian volunteers who did their basic training in Nova Scotia. The 40th battalion were mainly from Palestine, and the 40th Palestinian battalion came from Jews in the Ottoman Empire, which means Palestine. And the 41st and 42nd were reserve battalions with men from Palestine, sometimes stationed in Plymouth, in England. The following incident involving the Judeans took place in the Brighton Synagogue on England's south coast on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, 1918. The Jewish Chronicle reported on the 20th of September, 1918, that the notes from the shofar had barely died away after the Yom Kippur service when Reverend Lieberman ascended the pulpit, which had previously been surrounded by a number of soldiers from the 38th Fusiliers, and accepted the national flag of white and blue silk fringed with golden tassels, which he then placed over the pulpit. He thanked the Judeans for their precious gift, as having been offered in heartfelt recognition of the warm welcome accorded them by the Brighton community. Later that evening, after the soldiers had broken their fast at the Jewish Soldiers Institute in Upper North Street, the community gave the Judeans a rousing send-off prior to their return to their Plymouth barracks. The slideshow shows the men of the 38th Fusiliers with their flag. One of my great-uncles, Lieutenant Philip Jacobs, was serving in the 13th Battalion King's Royal Rifles at Ypres Salient when he received a message from Chief Rabbi Hertz asking him to consider transferring to the Jewish Regiment. He was then persuaded to volunteer for duty in the 40th Battalion Royal Fusiliers when it was formed in 1918. And under his command were the likes of David Ben-Gurion, first Prime Minister of Israel, as well as several of his colleagues in the Judeans, who were to become leaders of the Zionist labor movement. And they are also in the book. Burl Katz-Nelson, who also served in the Tsar Mule Corps, was an intellectual and the first editor of Devar, the workers' newspaper. Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, who became the second president of the State of Israel. Eliyahu Golom, one of the leaders of the Jewish defense effort in Mandate Palestine. And Dov Hos, he was initially trained as an officer with the Turkish army, but escaped and served alongside his colleagues in the 40th Fusiliers. He eventually became Ben-Gurion's personal representative in London, dealing successfully with the British government during the 1930s.
The Jewish Chronicle sees the recording of the service of these men in the book as a record of a war of liberation very dear to the heart of the Jew. After nearly 2,000 years of exile, the gates of the promised land are to be again opened to them. Palestine does not now appear to the Jew in the form of a mirage. There is at last some actuality about the return of our people to their long-lost home. After tribulations and disappointments, the immediate prospect of a revival of Jewish nationality has been secured. Finally, as the book itself states, the British Jewry Book of Honour was planned as a permanent record of the service of all the 50,000 Jews who, from all parts of the British Empire, served in the Great War, so that in days to come, all may have before them, in a permanent form, the remembrance of these men and know how to hold them in honour and lasting thankfulness.
Thank you very much.
Lecture. We do have some questions, and I kindly ask our audience to ask even more. So actually, also, this is a question to you, Daniel. Maybe you can help, because Bea is asking, are there any records for the Royal Fusiliers 38th and 39th battalions in Israel today, for those who left London in September 1918, fought in Palestine, and then went to Washington, D.C.? I haven't found any records in the UK, neither USA and Netanya, or online, and I'm still trying to find my relative David. Do you know anything about this?
Where did the relative live? Do we know? Did they live in England, or were they American?
My relative was Russian, but came to London for a time, and he joined from London in August 1918.
You may be able to find his name in the National Archives.
I've exhausted every single UK archive, and this is why I'm wondering if there's anything else in Israel that might have a record that the UK and America have not got.
You've said you've been to Netanya, so that's the only one I know.
Right.
They have.
If their names are not in the book, if the name is not in the book, it doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't serve, because the there are a large number of Americans who we know served but are not listed. The records are not very good. I mean, I've found people who are listed as serving in the Judeans, but their record, I found their medal card in the archives, but they're not in the book. I'm sorry, we can't. We
don't know of anywhere else.
I'll just add that we have in the National Library of Israel, in our archives, we have a short list compiled by Joseph Trumpeldor himself, a list of, I believe, of Russian Jews serving under his command. Again, it's not a very long list, but if you have a name and you'd like me to take a look, you can email us at the library, on the library's website.
Somebody's made a very good point. You need to be a bit fluid with how you spell names, because I've said that, they were not fussy about how that people's names were spelt. So you have to. Yes, yeah, but yes, David Ben Gurion's another one. I mean, there's loads of them. They're all often spelt wrongly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Rose Feldman, I see you would like to ask something, so I will unmute you. It will be much easier, and you can speak now.
Thank you. The Israel Genealogy Research Association has the list from Netanya in our collection, and we also have the list from Jabotinsky at the National. Those who serve with Jabotinsky, that is at the National Library, we also have that list in our collection. Now, the registration for our website is free, which will allow you to do a search to see if the name appears in our collection. On those two collections, on the one from Netanya, we don't have scans. I think we have a scan from what is in the National Library. Thank you.
Can you give us the email address, please?
I put it in the chat.
No, you've got-
I'm actually signed on.
oh, right.
I will have a look later. Thank you.
Tadeusz, have any more questions?
Yeah, I was sorry, I was muted. Is there anyone else? Debbie Efron. Okay, I will unmute you. And you can speak now, Debbie.
Thank you. I put it in the chat. My grandfather, Louis Gordon, had arrived in England in 1906 from Poland, and he enlisted in the British Army and was a soldier fighting in France in World War I. That is all I know. And there's nobody left in the family that I can ask. Do you have any suggestions where I could start looking for more details?
Yeah, well, I can give you a few places to start looking. You might actually what's the
Ancestry.
No, I wasn't going to say it. The ones that, the National Archives in London. If you go on to Discovery National Archives, you just sign on and join up, and if you're online, you can download things for what they've got for nothing. So they might have his record card. But are you sure his name was originally Gordon?
Yes.
Okay. And if you go onto our site, you can actually search through the British Jewry Book of Honour. There are a few places you can search for the British Jewry Book of Honour, but our website you can.
Ah, okay.
Could you put your website address into chat, or
Yes.
I will?
Yeah, sure, I'll do that.
Presumably, you need more. If you're going to search for him on any archive, you need to know their date of birth, when they died, which will help you. Ancestry, and Find My Past, and Forces War Records, for example. Unfortunately, they're all you have to pay to get answers from them for the information, but they will all, you will be able to find him. But we would need for us to find him, I'd need more information about parents and date of birth, and so we can, because there are an awful lot of Gordons about, I would think.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Welcome. No records of Xenobic on my grandfather. 38th Labour. It's in the Book of Honour, I believe, the Labour Corps. I might be wrong, but I believe it's in the Book of Honour.
This is.
I'm just reading something.
This is a message.
I'm just looking on the.
From Ingrid Rockberger, saying there are no records survived. Again, you possibly can. It's amazing what you can find if you know more information about them. You need the basic information, and even if I've done simple searches, like just put their name and World War I, and sometimes you're lucky. Right.
Wonderful.
But I mean, all I can suggest is, if you email us, we may be able to help you. Right, but we can't guarantee that we'll find anything. British Jews in the First World War is a website that has now probably more than 3,000 web pages of each person who served, and it has a wealth of other information such as history pages and photographs from World War I. So it's a fantastic resource, and I suggest, I commend everybody to use it if possible, if they can.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And this has been fascinating. You've really brought this book, which is a list, to life. I'm sure it gives far more information about Anglo Jewry and other aspects of life in those in that period beyond the military aspects, but also it's brought it really your research shows what a panoramic account that the book gives, covering so many aspects of world history and that period all over the world and all over the British Empire. So thank you for that. It's really been a very enriching discussion and very moving as well.
Anybody in London, Ajax has a copy of the book in the office in Hendon. If you want to email Ajax, we will happily look up to check if there's any name that you think is there but you don't know about, but we have a copy.
Good luck.
Yeah.
They've also reprinted it. There's also a reprint, actually.
Yeah.
The reprint is very much smaller. We have the big original one as well as
I've got both, actually.
And
but I have to admit, it is falling to pieces, our one. So
I know you have several.
Take it on.
I know you have several, because I remember that because I used to volunteer for Ajax at one point.
Well, come and join us again. We can always use you.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. And we hope to see you at our next event.
Hope to see you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. And of course, thank you, Lola and Ronnie. And have a good evening.